An old man found a bear trapped in a snare. Moved by compassion, he decided to set it free, unaware of the impact this gesture would have. But what the bear did next surprised the old man and changed their lives forever. In the tranquil forest of Eureka, California, where ancient redwoods reached toward the sky like silent guardians, Walter Harris had found his sanctuary. At 68, his weathered hands now tended to a small wooden cabin, embraced by the constant whispers of nature. This wasn't just a retirement choice. It was a healing journey for a veteran seeking solace from the shadows of his past. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. Stay tuned. The cabin stood as a humble testament to simplicity, its wooden walls weathered by time and elements. A small vegetable garden flourished nearby, where Walter spent his mornings coaxing life from the rich soil. Each day followed a rhythm as natural as the forest itself, tending to his plants, maintaining his modest home, and taking long walks among the towering trees. These daily wanderings weren't mere exercise. They were Walter's meditation, his way of processing decades of memories that had driven him from city life. The forest had become more than his home. It was his confidant, his healer, and increasingly, his purpose. The constant symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves provided a gentle backdrop to his thoughts, so different from the chaos he'd left behind. On this particular morning, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The familiar trail stretched before him, dappled sunlight playing through the canopy above. As Walter ventured deeper into the woods, an unusual sound broke through the natural chorus, a distressed animal's cry that stopped him in his tracks. His veteran's instincts kicked in, and he moved carefully toward the source. What he discovered changed everything. A black bear, magnificent despite its predicament, lay trapped in a cruel snare. The sight triggered memories Walter had spent years trying to forget, but something stronger emerged alongside the pain, an overwhelming urge to help. With careful movements and soothing words, he approached the trapped animal. Time seemed to slow as Walter worked to free the bear. His hands, steady from years of practice in high-pressure situations, moved with deliberate precision. The bear's dark eyes met his, and in that moment, a connection formed, a mutual understanding between two beings who had known suffering. When the trap finally released its grip, the bear disappeared swiftly into the underbrush, leaving Walter alone with his thoughts and a newfound sense of purpose. Back at his cabin, Walter couldn't shake the image of the trapped bear from his mind. As evening settled over the forest, he began noticing details he'd overlooked before. Unusual marks on trees, disturbed undergrowth, and the occasional glint of metal in the shadows. His sanctuary was under threat, and the realization stirred something deep within him. The following days brought a shift in Walter's forest routine. His walks became more purposeful, his senses heightened to every unusual sound or sight. He discovered more traps, each one more sophisticated than the last, speaking of organization and resources beyond simple hunting. The forest he'd come to love was being systematically exploited, and the thought filled him with a quiet determination. In town, whispers reached his ears about Roy McAllister, a local figure known for his hunting activities. The name seemed to inspire both fear and reluctant respect among the townspeople. Martha, the elderly shopkeeper who'd become Walter's main connection to the outside world, warned him in hushed tones about McAllister's growing influence in the region. As darkness settled over his cabin that evening, Walter sat on his porch, listening to the night sounds of the forest. The peace he'd sought in isolation now seemed incomplete without action. The skills he'd hoped to leave behind might serve a new purpose, protecting this place that had given him sanctuary when he needed it most. Little did Walter know that his encounter with the trapped bear was just the beginning, The forest had chosen its guardian, and the solitary man who had come seeking peace was about to find himself at the center of a struggle that would test not only his resolve, but also his belief in the healing power of nature and community. As the moon cast long shadows through the trees, Walter Harris began to understand that sometimes the greatest acts of peace require the courage to stand and fight for what's right. In the days following his encounter with the trapped bear, Walter's peaceful routine took on a new dimension. Each morning walk became a careful survey of his beloved forest, his trained eyes scanning for signs of intrusion. The traps he discovered weren't amateur setups. They spoke of professional craftsmanship and significant financial backing. The name Roy McAllister emerged more frequently in local conversations. At the general store, where Walter made his monthly supply runs, people would lower their voices when discussing McAllister's activities. He was a prominent figure in the community, known for his extensive hunting operations that seemed to grow more ambitious with each passing season. Walter's military training, skills he'd hoped to leave behind, now served a different purpose. He began mapping the locations of traps, noting patterns in their placement that suggested a systematic approach to exploiting the forest. Each discovery reinforced his growing conviction that this was more than random hunting. It was an organized operation with deep roots in the community. The forest itself seemed to respond to the increasing pressure. Wildlife patterns changed, with animals appearing in unusual places at unexpected times. Walter noticed fewer birds in areas where they'd once been abundant, and the natural rhythm of the forest felt disrupted. His small cabin, once a haven of solitude, now felt like an observation post in an escalating conflict. One morning, while documenting another sophisticated trap location, Walter noticed fresh tire tracks near his property. The marks weren't from his own vehicle or any of the usual Forest Service vehicles he'd grown familiar with. Someone was watching him, studying his movements. The realization didn't frighten him. Instead, it strengthened his resolve to protect the forest that had become his home. As autumn approached, bringing shorter days and longer shadows, Walter began receiving subtle warnings from friendly locals. Martha, the shopkeeper who'd become his closest link to the town, pulled him aside one day. "Be careful up there, Walter," she whispered, her eyes darting around the store. "McAllister's men don't take kindly to interference. They've been asking questions about you." The warning only confirmed what Walter had already sensed. His activities hadn't gone unnoticed, and the pressure was mounting. Strange vehicles would appear on the forest roads near his property, their occupants never visible, but their presence unmistakable. At night, he sometimes heard engines in the distance, their sound carrying through the otherwise quiet forest. It was during this time that Walter met Ann Carter. She arrived at his cabin one morning, her credentials as a wildlife biologist impeccable, but it was the determination in her eyes that caught his attention. Anne had been tracking the impact of illegal hunting activities in the region, and her research had led her to Walter's corner of the forest. Their first conversation stretched from morning into afternoon, as they discovered their shared concern for the forest's welfare. Anne's scientific approach complemented Walter's practical experience, and together they began piecing together a clearer picture of the situation. She showed him maps dotted with markers indicating wildlife disruption patterns, many concentrating around his area. "This isn't random, Mr. Harris," Anne explained, spreading her documentation across his rough wooden table. "These operations are systematic, well-funded, and growing. But proving it requires more than just theories." Her fingers traced lines, connecting various incidents, creating a pattern that matched Walter's own observations. As they talked, Walter found himself sharing more than just his recent discoveries. He told her about the bear he'd freed, watching her face light up with professional interest and genuine concern, and revealed that she'd been tracking that same bear as part of her research before it disappeared from her study area. Their discussion was interrupted by the distant sound of vehicles moving through the forest. Anne quickly gathered her materials, her expression serious. "They're getting bolder," she observed, her voice tight with concern. "Mr. Harris, I know I'm asking a lot, but would you consider working with me? Your knowledge of this area could be invaluable." That evening, after Anne had left, Walter sat on his porch watching the sun set behind the towering trees. The forest had given him peace when he needed it most, and now it seemed to be asking something in return. The skills he'd gained through years of service, the very experiences he'd tried to leave behind, might now serve a greater purpose. As darkness settled over the forest, Walter made his decision. The solitary life he'd sought would have to give way to something more important, protecting the sanctuary that had helped heal his own wounds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face them. The forest had chosen its defenders, and Walter Harris was prepared to answer its call. The partnership between Walter and Anne quickly evolved into a methodical investigation of the illegal hunting activities. Each morning, Anne would arrive at Walter's cabin with her research equipment, and together they would document new evidence of McAllister's expanding operations. Their combined expertise, Walter's intimate knowledge of the forest, and Anne's scientific background, created a comprehensive picture of the environmental damage being inflicted. During their investigations, they discovered that local businesses were somehow connected to McAllister's activities. Anne's research revealed financial links between seemingly legitimate enterprises and the sophisticated hunting equipment appearing in the forest. The traps they found weren't simple snares, but rather expensive custom-made devices that spoke of significant investment. "These aren't just random hunters," Anne explained one morning, examining a particularly complex mechanism. "This is organized, well-funded, and spreading faster than we anticipated." She pulled out her tablet, showing Walter patterns of wildlife disruption that matched perfectly with his ground observations. The scale of the operation was becoming alarmingly clear. The hunters were growing bolder, pushing their activities closer to Walter's property. Fresh tire tracks appeared regularly near his cabin, and broken branches marked surveillance positions in the surrounding woods. It was clear that McAllister's men were watching, sending a message that their presence was known and unwelcome. One foggy morning, as Walter and Anne documented another trap site, they heard movement in the undergrowth. Years of experience told them this wasn't wildlife. The footsteps were too deliberate, too human. Walter signaled Anne to remain still as they waited, tension filling the air. From the mist emerged a young man in expensive hunting gear, his face a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Walter recognized him immediately as Tommy McAllister, Roy's nephew, whom he'd seen in local newspaper photographs. The young man froze upon seeing them, clearly torn between fleeing and staying. "You look like you could use some water," Walter said calmly, diffusing the tension with a simple act of kindness. The offer seemed to break through Tommy's anxiety, and after a moment's hesitation, he accepted the bottle Anne offered. As the fog swirled around them, Tommy began to talk. His words came hesitantly at first, then in a rush, as if he'd been waiting for someone to listen. He had joined his uncle's operation, believing it was legitimate, but the reality had proven far different. The young man's conscience had been weighing heavily on him as he witnessed the increasingly aggressive tactics being employed. "I didn't know it would be like this," Tommy confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Uncle Roy said we were just hunting, but—" He looked around nervously, as if the trees themselves might report his betrayal. "The things they're doing now, the way they're treating the forest, it's wrong." Anne listened intently, occasionally asking careful questions that revealed the depth of her understanding about illegal wildlife operations. Tommy's answers confirmed their suspicions while adding new layers of complexity to the situation. The operation was larger than they had imagined, with connections reaching into unexpected places within the community. As the morning wore on, Tommy's demeanor shifted from fearful to resolved. "I want to help," he declared, straightening his shoulders. "This forest, it's special. What they're doing isn't just about hunting anymore. They're destroying something irreplaceable." The distant sound of approaching vehicles cut through the fog, sending Tommy into a panic. "That's Uncle Roy's patrol," he whispered urgently. "They can't find me here." Before disappearing into the mist, he quickly shared vital information about the operation's patterns and key locations. That evening, as Walter and Anne reviewed their notes at his cabin, the weight of their discovery settled over them. Tommy's information had filled crucial gaps in their understanding, but it had also revealed the true scope of what they faced. The forest around them seemed different now, its silence heavy with expectation. Walter stepped onto his porch, listening to the night sounds of the forest. The peace he'd sought in isolation now seemed incomplete without action. The skills he'd hoped to leave behind would serve a new purpose, protecting this place that had given him sanctuary when he needed it most. As moonlight filtered through the canopy, Walter and Anne began formulating their next steps. They had an ally now in Tommy, someone on the inside who could provide crucial information, but with this new knowledge came increased risk. McAllister's men would be watching more closely than ever. The forest had brought them together, a veteran seeking peace, a scientist fighting for preservation, and a young man choosing conscience over family loyalty. As the night deepened around them, they knew their real challenge was just beginning. The coming days would test not just their resolve, but their ability to protect the sanctuary that had brought healing to more than just Walter's wounded spirit. The autumn storm arrived with unexpected fury, transforming the usually peaceful forest into a symphony of howling wind and driving rain. Walter stood at his cabin window, watching sheets of water cascade through the canopy above. The weather had forced a temporary pause in their investigation, giving him time to process the magnitude of what they'd uncovered through Tommy's revelations. Lightning illuminated the darkened forest, and in that brief flash, Walter caught sight of movement at the edge of his property. His instincts, honed by years of experience, told him this wasn't one of McAllister's men. The movement was different, more natural. Grabbing his raincoat and flashlight, he stepped out into the downpour. The beam of his light cut through the rain, revealing a sight that stopped him in his tracks. There, at the forest's edge, stood the black bear he had freed from the trap weeks ago. The animal was clearly injured, moving with difficulty, fresh wounds suggesting another encounter with one of the cruel devices that had been multiplying throughout the forest. Without hesitation, Walter began preparing the small storage shed adjacent to his cabin. Years of military service had taught him basic veterinary care, skills he'd used on countless occasions in the field. The bear, remarkably, seemed to remember him, allowing him to approach with a mix of trust and caution that spoke of their previous encounter. Through the night, Walter worked to clean and treat the bear's wounds, speaking softly to the injured animal. The trust between them was extraordinary, as if the bear understood that this human was different from those who had caused its suffering. Outside, the storm raged on, providing cover for this unusual act of mercy. The next morning, Anne arrived earlier than usual, concern evident on her face. "I was worried about you up here alone in the storm," she began, then stopped short at the sight of the bear resting in the shed. Her scientific interest immediately kicked in as she examined the animal's wounds, confirming Walter's suspicions about the type of trap that had caused them. "These injuries tell us something important," Anne explained, documenting everything with her camera. "The pattern matches the new traps we've been finding, the ones Tommy told us about. They're testing their equipment closer to your property." The implication was clear. McAllister's operation was closing in. Over the next few days, as the bear recovered in the makeshift shelter, Walter and Anne noticed increased activity around the property. Unfamiliar vehicles would pass by on the forest road, slowing near his driveway. Strange sounds in the night suggested they were being watched more closely than ever. The bear's presence became both a symbol of resistance and a source of concern. If McAllister's men discovered they were harboring an injured animal, it would give them the excuse they needed to move against Walter directly. Yet neither Walter nor Anne could bring themselves to force the bear back into the dangerous forest before it had healed. During this time, their bond with the animal grew stronger. The bear's resilience reminded Walter of his own journey of healing in these woods. Anne's scientific observations gave way to genuine affection as she documented the bear's recovery, noting how its presence had transformed their understanding of the forest's fragile balance. Tommy made periodic secret visits, bringing crucial information about his uncle's operations while marveling at the unlikely sanctuary Walter had created. "Uncle Roy's getting impatient," he warned during one such visit. "He knows something's happening here, but he can't figure out exactly what. The men are talking about doing a thorough search of the area." The warning spurred Walter and Anne to accelerate their documentation efforts. They knew their time might be limited, but the bear's presence had given them something unexpected, a living testament to both the cruelty they were fighting against and the compassion they were fighting for. As autumn deepened, the bear's strength returned, though it showed no inclination to leave the safety of Walter's property. Its presence attracted other wildlife, as if the animals sensed a safe haven in this small corner of the threatened forest. Walter's cabin, once a retreat from the world, had become a symbol of resistance against those who would exploit nature's vulnerability. One evening, as Walter and Anne reviewed their growing collection of evidence, the sound of multiple vehicles approaching broke the forest's peace. Through the gathering dusk, they could see headlights moving along the forest road, more than usual and moving with purpose. The bear, sensing the tension, moved restlessly in its shelter. They had known this confrontation was coming, but its arrival still felt sudden. As darkness fell over the forest, Walter, Anne, and their unlikely ally prepared for what promised to be a long night. The sanctuary they had created was about to face its greatest test, and the lines between protector and protected had never been more blurred. The heightened presence of McAllister's men around Walter's property created an atmosphere of constant tension. Their vehicles would appear at random hours, engines idling on the forest road, a clear message that they were watching and waiting. Walter maintained his calm exterior, but his military training had kicked in fully now. He was constantly alert, aware of every unusual sound or movement in the forest. Anne's research had taken on a new urgency. She had begun connecting the sophisticated traps they'd discovered to specific manufacturers, building a paper trail that led to several local businesses. "These aren't just random suppliers," she explained one morning, spreading documents across Walter's kitchen table. "There's a pattern here. Shell companies, hidden ownership, all leading back to McAllister's network." The bear's continued presence on Walter's property had become both a blessing and a complication. Its recovery was remarkable, the wounds healing cleanly under their care. More surprisingly, the animal had developed a routine, staying close to the shed during the day and making short forays into the nearby forest at night. Its behavior suggested an intelligence and adaptability that fascinated Anne, who spent hours documenting its recovery. "This isn't just about one bear anymore," Anne observed, watching the animal from the cabin's window. "What we're seeing here is proof of something larger, the forest's ability to heal itself when given the chance, the connection between all living things." Her scientific objectivity had given way to a deeper understanding of what they were fighting to protect. Tommy's visits became more frequent but also more cautious. Each time he arrived, he brought new information about his uncle's operations, but also increasingly disturbing news. "Uncle Roy's getting pressure from his business partners," he whispered during one clandestine meeting. "They're losing money because of the disrupted hunting schedules." He's talking about doing something big, something to clear out all the interference at once. The warning cast a shadow over their work, but it also strengthened their resolve. Walter and Anne had begun reaching out to trusted members of the community, carefully sharing their findings. To their surprise, they discovered others who had witnessed McAllister's activities but had been too afraid to speak out. A network of concerned citizens was slowly forming, each bringing their own pieces to the larger puzzle. One evening, as Walter conducted his nightly property check, he discovered fresh boot prints near the shed where the bear rested. Someone had been close, too close. The prints showed they had observed the bear but had retreated without taking action. It was another message. This one more direct than the others. They knew about the injured animal, and they were biding their time. Anne arrived the next morning with more disturbing news. Her research equipment in various parts of the forest had been tampered with, some of it destroyed. "They're trying to erase our evidence," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "But they don't realize I've been backing up everything, sending copies to trusted colleagues outside the area." The pressure was mounting, but so was their support. Martha from the general store had begun acting as their eyes and ears in town, quietly passing along information about McAllister's movements. Other locals, inspired by their stand, had started reporting suspicious activities to Anne, helping her build a more complete picture of the operation's scope. The bear's presence had attracted unexpected allies as well. Wildlife enthusiasts and nature photographers, hearing rumors of the remarkable relationship between the animal and its human protectors, began documenting the forest's wildlife with renewed purpose. Each image, each observation, added to the growing body of evidence showing the impact of McAllister's activities on the ecosystem. As autumn turned colder, Walter noticed more wildlife seeking refuge near his property. It was as if the animals sensed that this small corner of the forest offered safety. The bear's recovery had created a ripple effect, turning Walter's modest cabin into an unofficial sanctuary for the forest's displaced inhabitants. One crisp morning, Anne arrived with a determined look in her eyes. "We need to move faster," she announced, pulling out her latest findings. "McAllister's operation is expanding more rapidly than we thought. They're bringing in new equipment, setting up permanent structures deep in the forest. If we don't act soon, there might not be anything left to save." The urgency in her voice matched the growing tension in the air. Walter could feel it. They were approaching a tipping point. The peaceful forest he had sought for healing had become a battleground, not of violence, but of wills. The question wasn't just about saving one bear or stopping one illegal operation. It was about standing up for something larger than themselves. As evening settled over the forest, Walter sat on his porch, watching the bear make its careful way along the edge of the clearing. The animal's presence reminded him of why they had chosen this path. In helping it heal, they had discovered a deeper truth about healing itself. Sometimes it required not just patience and care, but the courage to stand against those who would prevent it. The turning point came unexpectedly, on a quiet Sunday morning when the forest was shrouded in autumn mist. Anne arrived at Walter's cabin earlier than usual, her face flushed with excitement. She had spent the night analyzing documents that Tommy had secretly provided, and what she discovered changed everything. "Look at this," she said, spreading papers across Walter's kitchen table. "These aren't just hunting permits or business licenses. These are detailed financial records showing connections between McAllister's operation and several prominent local businesses. The money trail leads to accounts that don't match their reported income. This is exactly what we needed." Walter studied the documents carefully, his military training helping him spot patterns in the complex web of transactions. The evidence was compelling. McAllister's hunting operation was just the visible part of a much larger network. The sophisticated traps they'd been finding in the forest were being funded through an elaborate scheme involving several legitimate-looking businesses. As they discussed their next steps, Tommy arrived unexpectedly, his usual caution replaced by urgent concern. "Uncle Roy's planning something big," he said, still catching his breath. "He's called in favors from all his business partners. They're planning to clear out this entire section of the forest, starting with your property, Walter." The news galvanized them into action. Anne immediately began making calls to her scientific colleagues and environmental organizations, sharing their documented evidence. Walter reached out to his contacts in the veteran community, many of whom had found their own peace in nature and understood what was at stake. The bear, now mostly recovered, seemed to sense the changing atmosphere. It stayed closer to the cabin, its presence a constant reminder of what they were fighting to protect. Other wildlife had begun gathering in the area too, as if drawn to this last safe haven in the increasingly threatened forest. Martha, the general store owner, proved to be an unexpected ally. She had been quietly gathering information from customers and fellow business owners who were tired of McAllister's influence over the community. "People are scared," she told Walter during one of his supply runs, "but they're also angry. They've watched him take more and more control over our town, and they want it to stop." Word spread through the community like wildfire. Small business owners who had been pressured into supporting McAllister's operations began speaking out. Local environmental groups, energized by Anne's scientific evidence, organized peaceful protests. The forest that had once been Walter's solitary refuge was becoming a symbol of resistance against corruption and environmental exploitation. Tommy's role became increasingly crucial. Despite the personal cost of standing against his uncle, he continued providing information about the operation's plans. His courage inspired others within McAllister's organization to question their involvement. Some even began reaching out to Anne, offering their own testimony about the illegal activities they had witnessed. The bear's story became a rallying point. Local media picked up on the tale of the injured animal finding sanctuary with a reclusive veteran, and how this unlikely partnership had unveiled a larger threat to the community's natural heritage. Photos of the recovering bear, taken by Anne for her research, put a face to the environmental damage being caused by the illegal hunting operations. Walter's cabin, once a haven of solitude, became a gathering point for an increasingly organized resistance. Environmental activists, concerned citizens, and even former employees of McAllister's operation would meet there, sharing information and planning their response to the impending threat. And scientific documentation, combined with Tommy's insider knowledge and the community's growing support, created a comprehensive picture of the damage being done to the forest ecosystem. Maps showed the spread of illegal hunting activities, while financial records revealed the complex network of businesses supporting these operations. The transformation of the community was remarkable. People who had long remained silent out of fear began finding their voices. Local artists created works depicting the forest's beauty and the threat it faced. School children organized nature walks and wildlife observation projects. What had started as one man's stand to protect an injured bear had evolved into a movement. As evening settled over the forest, Walter sat on his porch with Anne and Tommy, watching the bear forage peacefully at the edge of the clearing. The animal's presence seemed to exemplify everything they were fighting for: the right of nature to exist undisturbed, the importance of standing up against exploitation, and the power of unexpected alliances. "They'll make their move soon," Tommy said quietly, breaking the peaceful moment. "Uncle Roy isn't used to opposition. He won't back down easily." The warning hung in the air, but it didn't carry the same weight of fear it once might have. They weren't alone anymore. The community had awakened to the value of what they stood to lose, and they were ready to stand together to protect it. The morning dawned with an unusual stillness that made Walter's veteran instincts tingle. The fog hung low among the trees, creating an ethereal atmosphere around his cabin. He had spent the night reviewing the security measures they had put in place, knowing that McAllister's response to their growing opposition would come soon. Anne arrived just as the sun began burning through the morning mist, her car loaded with additional documentation equipment. They had been carefully cataloguing everything, every trap found, every piece of evidence gathered, every statement from community members who had stepped forward. The bear, now almost fully recovered, watched their activities from its usual spot near the shed, its presence a constant reminder of why their fight mattered. "The community response has been overwhelming," Anne said, sorting through the latest batch of photographs and testimonies. "More people are coming forward every day with information about McAllister's operations. Even some of his business partners are starting to distance themselves." Her voice carried a mix of hope and concern. They were making progress, but that also made them more of a threat. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching broke through their discussion. Through the thinning fog, they could see a convoy of trucks making its way up the forest road toward Walter's property. Tommy had warned them this might happen, McAllister making a show of force to intimidate them into backing down. "They're here," Walter said calmly, years of military experience keeping his voice steady. The bear, sensing the tension, moved closer to the cabin. Its behavior had become remarkably attuned to their moods over the weeks of recovery, and now it seemed to understand that something significant was about to happen. As the vehicles pulled up to Walter's property, Roy McAllister himself stepped out of the lead truck. It was the first time Walter had seen him in person, a tall, imposing figure used to getting his way. Several of his men spread out behind him, their stance meant to be intimidating. "Mr. Harris," McAllister called out, his voice carrying across the clearing, "I think it's time we had a conversation about your interference in local business matters." His eyes swept over the property, lingering on Anne's research equipment and the bear near the shed. "You're causing a lot of problems for people who just want to make an honest living." Walter stepped off his porch, positioning himself between McAllister's group and the cabin where Anne was documenting everything. "The only honest thing to discuss here is what you've been doing to this forest," he replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced far worse threats. The confrontation that followed was tense but controlled. McAllister alternated between veiled threats and attempts at negotiation, while Walter stood his ground, supported by the evidence they had gathered and the community that now stood behind them. The bear's presence added an unexpected element. Its calm demeanor, despite the tension, seemed to underscore the natural order they were fighting to protect. "You don't understand what you're up against," McAllister warned, his frustration showing as his intimidation tactics failed to have the desired effect. "This is bigger than you, bigger than your little wildlife crusade." "No, Roy," came a familiar voice from behind them. Tommy stepped out from one of the other vehicles, moving to stand beside Walter. "You're the one who doesn't understand what you're up against anymore." The young man's voice shook slightly, but his resolve was clear. McAllister's face darkened at his nephew's betrayal, but before he could respond, more vehicles appeared on the forest road. This time, they brought members of the community, local business owners, environmental activists, and concerned citizens who had been quietly gathering strength and courage over the past weeks. Martha from the general store led the group, her usually gentle demeanor replaced by stern determination. "We've stood by long enough, Roy," she declared. "This forest belongs to all of us, and we won't let you destroy it anymore." The show of community support caught McAllister off guard. He looked around, seeing not just Walter and Anne, but a united front of local residents tired of watching their natural heritage being exploited. The bear, as if sensing the shift in power, moved to the edge of the clearing, a living symbol of the wilderness they were fighting to protect. As the morning fog finally lifted, the confrontation reached its turning point. McAllister's men, seeing the overwhelming community response and realizing the extent of the evidence gathered against them, began backing away toward their vehicles. The tide had turned, not through violence or force, but through the power of a community united in defense of their forest. Walter watched as McAllister's convoy retreated down the forest road, knowing this was not the end, but rather a crucial turning point. The community had found its voice, and the forest had found its defenders. As the gathered crowd began sharing stories and planning their next steps, the bear returned to its peaceful foraging, a reminder that nature's resilience often depends on humanity's willingness to stand in its defense. The days following the confrontation brought dramatic changes to the forest community. What had begun as Walter's solitary stand had blossomed into a full-fledged movement. The small clearing around his cabin became a hub of activity as community members gathered to share information and coordinate their efforts to protect the forest. Anne's scientific documentation had grown into a comprehensive database of environmental impact studies. Local teachers brought their students to learn about forest conservation, using the recovering bear as a living example of nature's resilience. The animal had become something of a local celebrity, though Walter and Anne carefully maintained its wild nature, ensuring it didn't become too dependent on human presence. It's remarkable how one act of compassion can spark such change, Anne observed one morning, watching a group of students carefully documenting wildlife activity near the cabin. When you freed that bear from the trap, you did more than save one animal. You awakened something in this community. Tommy, no longer burdened by his uncle's influence, had become an invaluable ally. His intimate knowledge of McAllister's operation helped them identify and document more illegal activities throughout the forest. The business partners are pulling out one by one, he reported during one of their daily meetings. Uncle Roy's network is starting to crumble. The local media had picked up the story, drawing attention to both the environmental issues and the community's response. Martha had transformed her general store into an informal information center where people could learn about the forest's ecosystem and report any suspicious activities they observed. "We should have done this years ago," Martha said, pinning another wildlife photo to the community board she'd set up. "Sometimes it takes one person standing up to remind the rest of us what's worth fighting for." Walter found himself adapting to his new role as a community leader, though he never sought the spotlight. His quiet strength and unwavering commitment to protecting the forest inspired others to find their own courage. Veterans from neighboring communities reached out, sharing their own stories of finding healing in nature and offering their support. The bear's presence continued to influence their efforts in unexpected ways. Its recovery had become a symbol of hope, demonstrating how nature could heal when given the chance. Wildlife photographers and researchers visited regularly, documenting the animal's behavior and its unique relationship with the community that had rallied to protect its habitat. One evening, as Walter and Anne reviewed the day's developments on his porch, they noticed something extraordinary. The bear, now fully healed, had returned from one of its forest excursions, accompanied by 2 cubs. The sight brought tears to Anne's eyes. It wasn't just survival they were witnessing, but the continuation of life itself. "This is why we fought," Walter said softly, watching the family of bears forage peacefully at the forest's edge. Not just to stop destruction, but to allow life to flourish. The cubs played under their mother's watchful eye, unaware of the human drama that had unfolded to protect their future. The community's efforts began showing tangible results. McAllister's hunting operations had been pushed back, and his business partners continued to withdraw their support. Local authorities, prompted by the overwhelming evidence gathered by Anne and the community, had launched formal investigations into the illegal activities. Tommy emerged as a strong voice for conservation, using his experience to help other communities identify and combat similar environmental threats. "We're not just protecting one forest," he explained to a group of visiting activists. "We're showing people everywhere that they have the power to stand up and make a difference." The transformation extended beyond just the immediate forest. Neighboring communities began implementing their own conservation programs, inspired by what they'd witnessed in Eureka. The network of concerned citizens grew, creating a web of protection that extended far beyond Walter's initial stand. As autumn painted the forest in brilliant colors, Walter's cabin remained a gathering point for environmental education and community action. The Bear family's regular visits reminded everyone of the delicate balance between human presence and wildlife preservation. They had found a way to coexist that respected both the needs of the community and the rights of the forest's original inhabitants. Anne's research had expanded to include studying this unique model of community-based conservation. "What we're seeing here is more than just environmental protection," she explained to a visiting group of university students. "It's a complete shift in how people relate to their natural environment. We're not just observing nature anymore, we're actively participating in its preservation." The forest's transformation continued as winter approached. McAllister's once powerful network was unraveling, with each passing day bringing news of another business partner distancing themselves from his operations. The sophisticated traps that had once littered the forest floor were being systematically removed and documented, each one serving as evidence in the ongoing investigation. Walter observed these changes from his cabin's porch, where he still spent his early mornings in quiet contemplation. The Bear family had established a regular pattern, visiting the clearing during dawn and dusk, their presence a living testament to the forest's resilience. The cubs had grown noticeably, their playful antics bringing smiles to visitors who came to learn about forest conservation. "We're seeing something unprecedented here," Anne explained during one of her regular research sessions. She had set up a small field station near Walter's cabin, where she coordinated with other scientists studying the impact of their conservation efforts. "The forest isn't just recovering, it's thriving. Wildlife patterns are stabilizing, and species we haven't seen in years are returning." Tommy had found his calling in environmental education, working with local schools to develop programs that taught children about forest conservation. His first-hand experience with both sides of the issue made him uniquely qualified to explain the importance of protecting natural habitats. "The kids get it," he told Walter one afternoon. "They understand that what we do today shapes the world they'll inherit tomorrow." The community's involvement had grown beyond simple conservation. Local artists created works inspired by the forest's beauty, their pieces displayed in Martha's store alongside educational materials about wildlife protection. Business owners who had once feared standing up to McAllister now proudly displayed their support for forest conservation initiatives. "It's like the whole town woke up," Martha observed, arranging a new display of local artwork in her store window. "People aren't just talking about protecting the forest anymore, they're actively working to make it better." Her store had become a symbol of the community's transformation, a place where environmental awareness merged with local culture. The Bear family's story had spread far beyond Eureka, attracting attention from environmental organizations and media outlets. However, Walter and Anne carefully managed this interest, ensuring that the animals' natural behaviors weren't disrupted by too much human attention. They had learned that true conservation meant finding the right balance between protection and preservation. One crisp morning, as Walter conducted his daily property check, he found fresh evidence that their efforts were bearing fruit. New animal tracks in the soft earth showed that more wildlife was returning to the area. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't for years, its natural rhythms restored now that the threat of illegal hunting had been largely removed. "The forest is healing itself," Anne noted, carefully documenting the new signs of wildlife activity. All it needed was a chance, people willing to stand up and say, enough. Her research had expanded to include studying how communities could work together to protect natural habitats, using Eureka's transformation as a model for other towns facing similar challenges. The change in Roy McAllister was perhaps the most surprising development. As his influence waned and his business partners abandoned him, he became increasingly isolated. Tommy reported that his uncle spent more time alone, watching his empire crumble as the community he had once controlled found its voice. The local authorities' investigation had gained momentum, fueled by the extensive evidence gathered by Anne and the community. Each documented trap, every financial record, and all the testimonies from former employees painted a picture of systematic environmental exploitation that could no longer be ignored. Walter's cabin, once a refuge from the world, had become a symbol of positive change. The porch where he had sought solitude now hosted community meetings and educational sessions. Yet somehow, the peace he had initially sought hadn't been lost. It had been transformed into something richer, more meaningful. The Bear family's regular visits reminded everyone of what they were fighting to protect. The cubs, growing more confident each day, represented hope for the forest's future. Their mother's trust in the humans who had helped her heal spoke to the possibility of coexistence between people and wildlife. As winter's first chill touched the forest, Walter reflected on how much had changed since that day he had freed a trapped bear. What had begun as a simple act of compassion had sparked a movement that transformed not just the forest, but an entire community. The healing he had sought in solitude had come instead through connection, with nature, with people, and with a cause greater than himself. The winter brought a different kind of beauty to the forest, with frost coating the branches and quiet snowfall muffling the usual sounds. Walter's cabin, now a cornerstone of the community's conservation efforts, stood as a warm beacon in the cold landscape. The smoke from his chimney curled up through the crisp air, while inside, another important meeting was taking place. Anne had called this gathering to share significant news. Her latest research, combined with the community's documentation efforts, had caught the attention of major environmental organizations. They want to establish a protected wildlife corridor through our forest, she announced to the assembled group, which included Tommy, Martha, and several other key community members. This would connect our forest to other protected areas, she continued, spreading maps across Walter's kitchen table. It would give wildlife safe passages for migration and prevent any future exploitation. The enthusiasm in her voice was contagious, sparking animated discussions among the gathered conservationists. The Bear family had adapted well to the winter conditions, though their visits to the clearing became less frequent as nature's rhythms guided them toward their winter patterns. When they did appear, the cubs, now noticeably larger, showed impressive survival skills that Anne carefully documented for her research. Tommy brought updates about the continuing investigation into his uncle's operations. The authorities are closing in, he reported. More former employees are coming forward with information. The whole network is unraveling. His voice carried no satisfaction at his uncle's downfall, only relief that the forest would be protected. The transformation of the community continued to amaze Walter. Local businesses that had once relied on McAllister's patronage had found new purpose in ecotourism and conservation efforts. Martha's store now offered guided nature walks and wildlife photography sessions, activities that brought sustainable income while preserving the forest's integrity. People are rediscovering their connection to this land, Martha observed, watching a group of visitors quietly observing wildlife from the designated viewing areas they had established. They're learning that you can prosper without destroying what makes this place special. Walter's role had evolved as well. While he still cherished his quiet moments on the porch at dawn, He had embraced his position as a mentor to younger conservation enthusiasts. His military experience proved invaluable in organizing patrol schedules and maintaining the forest's new protective measures. Anne's research station had expanded, now including sophisticated monitoring equipment that helped track wildlife movements throughout the forest. The data they collected showed encouraging signs of ecosystem recovery. Species that had been driven away by the hunting operations were gradually returning, restoring natural balance to the area. One snowy morning, as Walter and Anne reviewed the latest wildlife reports, they spotted something remarkable through the window. The bear family had returned, but they weren't alone. Other bears had joined them, suggesting that the animals were forming new social bonds and establishing larger territories now that they felt safe. "This is extraordinary," Anne whispered, quickly photographing the gathering. "We're witnessing the restoration of natural social behaviors that had been disrupted by hunting pressure." The bears moved peacefully through the clearing, demonstrating the success of their conservation efforts. The community's initiative had begun attracting attention from other towns facing similar challenges. Delegations would visit to learn about Eureka's transformation, eager to understand how they had managed to unite their community around environmental protection. Tommy had become an eloquent spokesperson for their cause, sharing his unique perspective on how communities could transition from exploitation to conservation. "It's not about choosing between prosperity and preservation," he would explain to visitors. "It's about finding ways to thrive that don't compromise our natural heritage." The winter days brought a different rhythm to their conservation efforts. While the cold limited some activities, it provided new opportunities to study the forest's seasonal changes and wildlife adaptation. Walter's cabin became a warm gathering place where strategies were planned and successes celebrated. As snowflakes danced outside the windows, Walter reflected on how far they had come. The solitude he had initially sought had been replaced by something far more meaningful, a sense of purpose shared with a community that had found its voice. The forest, once threatened by exploitation, was now protected by the very people who had learned to see its true value. The late winter brought a series of storms that tested the resilience of both the forest and its protectors. While heavy snow blanketed the landscape, Walter's cabin remained a steady beacon of hope and organization for the conservation efforts. The weather seemed to mark a turning point in their journey, as news arrived that would forever change the future of their beloved forest. Anne burst into the cabin one morning, her cheeks red from the cold and her eyes bright with excitement. "It's happening," she announced to Walter, who was preparing his morning coffee. "The Environmental Protection Order is being finalized. They're going to designate this entire area as a protected wildlife sanctuary." The news spread quickly through their network of supporters. The sanctuary status would provide legal protection far beyond what they had initially hoped for. It wasn't just their local forest that would be protected. The designation included connecting corridors to other natural areas, creating a vast network of protected land. Tommy arrived later that day, bringing additional encouraging news. "The investigation into Uncle Roy's operations is concluding," he reported, settling into his usual spot by the fireplace. "The authorities have all they need. The entire network is being dismantled, and the land they controlled will be added to the sanctuary." The bear family had remained close throughout the winter, their presence a constant reminder of what they had been fighting to protect. The cubs had grown remarkably, showing signs of the strong, independent bears they would become. Their mother's decision to remain in the area spoke volumes about the safety and security they had managed to establish. "They're not just survivors anymore," Anne observed, watching the bears through her research station's window. "They're thriving, and they're not alone." Her documentation showed increasing numbers of wildlife returning to the area, reclaiming territories that had long been too dangerous to inhabit. The community's transformation had become a model for other regions facing similar challenges. Martha's store now hosted regular workshops where representatives from other towns could learn about their journey from exploitation to conservation. People need to see that change is possible, she explained to a group of visitors. Sometimes it just takes one person standing up for what's right. Walter found himself reflecting on how far they had come from his initial solitary stand. The peaceful existence he had sought in isolation had evolved into something far more meaningful, a legacy of protection that would benefit generations to come. His military experience, which had once been a source of painful memories, had proved invaluable in organizing and maintaining their conservation efforts. The sanctuary designation brought new responsibilities and opportunities. Anne's research station expanded to include an educational center where schools could bring students to learn about forest ecology and wildlife conservation. The programs they developed emphasized the delicate balance between human presence and natural habitats. Tommy had grown into his role as a conservation leader, using his experience to help other communities recognize and address environmental threats. Every forest needs its defenders, he would tell groups of young activists. And every community has the power to protect what matters to them. The Bear family's story had become legendary in conservation circles, a powerful example of how one act of compassion could spark widespread change. Wildlife photographers and researchers regularly visited to document their progress, though Walter and Anne maintained strict protocols to ensure the bears' natural behaviors weren't disrupted. One particularly clear evening, as the winter sun set behind the snow-covered trees, Walter stood on his porch with Anne and Tommy watching the Bear family forage at the forest's edge. The cubs played in the snow while their mother kept a watchful eye, comfortable in the presence of the humans who had become their protectors. "Look at how far we've come," Anne said softly, her research notebook forgotten in her hands as she watched the scene before them. From one trapped bear to an entire protected sanctuary. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it." Walter nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The forest had given him healing when he needed it most, and in return, he had helped ensure its protection for future generations. The sanctuary would stand as a testament to what could be accomplished when people chose to stand together for something greater than themselves. The bears' presence in the clearing seemed to underscore the rightness of their efforts. These weren't just animals they had saved, they were partners in maintaining the delicate balance of the forest ecosystem. Their success proved that humans could choose to be protectors rather than exploiters of the natural world. Spring arrived in the forest with an explosion of new life. The sanctuary designation had transformed the area into a haven of biodiversity, and nowhere was this more evident than around Walter's cabin. The clearing that had once been a simple homestead now bustled with activity as researchers, conservationists, and community members worked together to protect and study the flourishing ecosystem. Anne's research center had become a hub of scientific activity. Her documentation of the Bear family's journey, combined with comprehensive data about the forest's recovery, was providing valuable insights into wildlife rehabilitation and ecosystem restoration. "What we're seeing here is unprecedented," she explained to a group of visiting scientists. "The speed of recovery, the return of native species, it's all happening faster than we could have hoped." The Bear family remained the heart of their success story. The cubs, nearly grown now, had developed into confident young bears, while their mother's continued presence near the cabin seemed to inspire other wildlife to return to the area. Their story had become a symbol of hope in conservation circles, proving that determined action could reverse environmental damage. Tommy had established a youth conservation program that brought students from across the region to learn about forest protection. "Understanding starts young," he told Walter, as they watched a group of children carefully documenting animal tracks. These kids will grow up knowing they can make a difference in protecting the natural world. The community's transformation continued to amaze everyone involved. Martha's store had evolved into an ecotourism center where visitors could learn about the forest's history and the importance of conservation. Local artists and craftspeople created works inspired by the forest's recovery, their pieces telling the story of a community that had found its voice in defending nature. Walter found deep satisfaction in these changes, though he maintained his preference for quiet observation. His porch remained a favorite gathering spot for morning strategy sessions and evening discussions about the sanctuary's future. The military precision he brought to organizing patrol schedules and maintaining protective measures had proven invaluable in establishing the sanctuary's operational procedures. Spring also brought news about Roy McAllister's former operation. The last pieces of his network had been dismantled, and the land was being incorporated into the protected sanctuary. Tommy handled this development with characteristic grace, focusing on the positive changes rather than dwelling on his uncle's downfall. "The forest is teaching us something important," Anne observed one morning as they watched a group of deer cautiously approach the clearing. "It's showing us that healing is possible, not just for nature, but for communities too. Everything we've accomplished here started with one simple act of compassion." The sanctuary's success had sparked similar initiatives in neighboring regions. Environmental groups studied their model of community-based conservation, while government agencies consulted them on wildlife protection strategies. Their approach of combining scientific research with community involvement was proving to be a powerful template for environmental restoration. Walter's role had evolved far beyond his initial solitary stand. While he still cherished his quiet moments observing the forest, he had become an inadvertent mentor to a new generation of conservation leaders. His experience and steady presence provided a foundation for their expanding efforts to protect the natural world. The Bear family's influence extended beyond their immediate surroundings. Their story had inspired other communities to look more closely at their own wildlife populations and natural resources. Photographs and videos of the bears, carefully documented by Anne's team, helped people understand the importance of preserving wild spaces and protecting animal habitats. As spring flowers bloomed in the forest clearings, the sanctuary hummed with activity. Research teams tracked wildlife movements, community groups conducted educational tours, and conservation workers maintained the delicate balance between human presence and natural habitats. The forest had become a living laboratory of environmental recovery and community engagement. One particularly beautiful morning, as Walter sat on his porch watching the sunrise, he reflected on how his search for solitude had led to something far more meaningful. The forest had not only provided him with healing, but had also given him a purpose: protecting this precious ecosystem for future generations. The peaceful coexistence of humans and wildlife around his cabin proved that with dedication and understanding, nature and civilization could thrive together. The full bloom of spring brought with it a sense of completion to the forest sanctuary. The transformation that had begun with Walter's simple act of compassion had grown into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The forest, once threatened by exploitation, now stood as a testament to the power of community action and environmental stewardship. On this particular morning, Walter stood on his porch, watching the first rays of sunlight filter through the canopy. The bear family had returned, but this time they weren't alone. Other bears had joined them, forming a small community of their own. The cubs, now nearly grown, showed the confident behavior of bears who had never known the fear of traps or hunters. Anne's research center had become a model for wildlife conservation studies worldwide. Scientists and environmentalists regularly visited to learn from their success in combining community involvement with scientific research. What we've created here goes beyond simple conservation, she explained to a group of international researchers. "We've shown that it's possible to restore not just the environment, but also the connection between people and nature." Tommy's youth programs had expanded beyond their original scope, now including exchange visits with other conservation projects around the country. "Every young person who learns to love and protect nature becomes a guardian of our future," he told Walter, watching a group of students carefully documenting plant species in the clearing. The sanctuary's success had rippled outward, inspiring similar initiatives in neighboring regions. What had started as a local effort to protect one forest had grown into a movement, showing communities everywhere that they had the power to stand up for their natural heritage. Martha's store, now a thriving ecotourism center, displayed photographs documenting their journey. Images of the injured bear Walter had first helped, the community's stand against McAllister's operations, and the forest's remarkable recovery told a story of transformation that inspired visitors from around the world. Walter's cabin, while still maintaining its character as a peaceful retreat, had become a symbol of positive change. The porch, where he had once sought solitude, now served as a gathering place for conservation planning and community celebrations. Yet somehow, the peace he had initially sought hadn't been lost. It had been transformed into something richer, more meaningful. The Bear family's regular visits reminded everyone of how their journey had begun. The mother bear, now comfortable in their presence, seemed to understand that this place represented safety not just for her and her cubs, but for all wildlife. Her trust in them served as a continuing validation of their efforts to protect the forest. Spring flowers carpeted the forest floor, and birdsong filled the air with a symphony of natural sounds. The ecosystem's recovery had exceeded even Anne's optimistic predictions. Species that hadn't been seen in the area for years were returning, creating a vibrant tapestry of biodiversity that proved nature's remarkable resilience when given the chance to heal. As Walter walked his daily route through the forest, now accompanied by Anne and Tommy, they could see the full extent of their success. The trails were well maintained, but unobtrusive, allowing visitors to experience the forest's beauty while minimizing human impact. Educational signs provided information about the wildlife and ecosystem, helping people understand the importance of conservation. The sanctuary had become more than just a protected area. It was a living example of how humans and nature could coexist in harmony. The community had found its strength not in exploiting the forest, but in preserving it for future generations. What had begun as one man's stand against destruction had evolved into a model of environmental stewardship that others could follow. As the sun reached its zenith, casting dappled shadows through the canopy, Walter, Anne, and Tommy watched the Bear family forage peacefully at the forest's edge. The scene embodied everything they had fought to achieve, a place where wildlife could thrive, where nature could heal, and where people could learn to be stewards rather than exploiters of the natural world. The forest had given Walter the peace he sought, not through isolation, but through connection with nature, with community, and with a purpose greater than himself. As he looked out over the thriving sanctuary that had grown from his simple act of compassion, he knew that their work would continue to inspire others long into the future. Dear listeners, we hope that Walter's journey of transformation has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched the forest he fought to protect. To continue experiencing more inspiring stories like this one, we've prepared a special playlist filled with equally captivating tales of courage, compassion, and community spirit. You'll find it by clicking the link to your left. If this story moved you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the depth of human connection and the power of positive change. Join us in the comment section below, We'd love to hear your thoughts about Walter's story and how it relates to your own experiences with nature and community. Remember, just as Walter discovered, sometimes the greatest changes begin with a single act of kindness.